The camera freezes on a moment that feels almost cinematic. Mike Pompeo leans back in his chair, his jaw tight, his glare fixed like a blade aimed directly at Jasmine Crockett. Across from him, Crockett doesn't flinch. Her posture is steady, her eyes sharp, leaning ever so slightly forward as if refusing to yield even an inch of ground. And then the silence. A silence so thick it presses on the air, holding everyone in the room captive. This was the moment Mike Pompeo thought he had her cornered, armed with decades of political experience, a resume filled with titles, and the confidence of someone used to winning arguments through sheer force. But then Jasmine Crockett shattered the silence with one reply that stunned even him. The seasoned heavyweight, the man who had commanded rooms across the globe, suddenly found himself speechless before a freshman congresswoman who refused to be intimidated. The room held its breath. The audience watching at home leaned closer to their screens, sensing they were witnessing more than just a heated exchange. This wasn't just another political squabble. It was a collision between old power and new truth, between arrogance and dignity, between a man who thought he could dismiss her and a woman who refused to be dismissed. How did it come to this? How did a veteran of Washington politics, a man who had served as the nation's chief diplomat, end up silenced by someone many in his circle had underestimated? And why did this moment matter so much, not just to the people in the room, but to millions watching online, replaying the clip, sharing it, turning it into a symbol? Because this was never just about one exchange. It was about something larger, about whose voices get to define America, about who gets dismissed and who gets heard, about whether dignity can still triumph over condescension in an era of shouting matches. But to understand why this moment matters, we need to go back. We need to trace the threads that brought these two figures face to face, to unpack the clash of histories, identities, and ambitions that set the stage for one of the most unexpected silences in modern political drama. What led to this jaw-dropping silence? The answer begins long before the camera is rolled. To understand the gravity of this confrontation, you first have to understand the man who picked the fight. Mike Pompeo has long carried himself as a political heavyweight, sharp-tongued, unflinching, and unapologetically certain of his own authority. From the military to Congress, from the CIA to the State Department, Pompeo's resume is stacked with titles that project power. He built a reputation as the kind of man who doesn't just win arguments but steamrolls them. For years, he wielded words like weapons, cutting down opponents with a smirk and a dismissive wave, treating debate less as dialogue and more as domination. In the world of Washington insiders, that reputation gave him an edge. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, a woman who did not come from the same polished halls of power. Her rise was not the product of elite networks or old guard grooming. It was born in the courtrooms of Texas, where she defended the voiceless against systems designed to silence them. It was forged in community meetings where mothers, workers, and everyday people found in her a rare kind of advocate, one who listened, one who fought, one who refused to trade authenticity for acceptance. Crockett's voice was not measured by seniority or pedigree, it was measured by conviction, and for her, every battle carried the weight of something larger than herself. When these two figures collided, the clash was never just personal, it was symbolic. On one side stood Pompeo, the embodiment of an establishment that believed authority flowed downward from titles and institutions. On the other stood Crockett, representing a new current of leadership that demanded authority flow upward from people and principles. So when Pompeo began pressing her, his words were not merely about her record. They cut deeper. He was questioning whether someone like her, a young black congresswoman, a first-term representative, a woman who refused to bend to the etiquette of deference, had any right to stand toe-to-toe with him at all. His challenge was laced with the arrogance of history, the unspoken belief that the weight of his years in power should be enough to crush her under it. But that is exactly what raised the stakes, because Crockett understood what so many in that room felt but could not say aloud. When Pompeo tried to diminish her, he was diminishing every voice that had fought its way into spaces long dominated by men like him. He was turning their exchange into a test of whether the old guard still held the power to define who gets taken seriously in America's public square. The audience watching, both in the chamber and across the country, felt the tension sharpen with each word. This was no longer just about fact checks or policy differences. It was about whether dignity could withstand arrogance, whether truth could survive condescension, whether representation could resist dismissal. And Jasmine Crockett knew all too well that this moment was bigger than her. For every young leader who had been told they weren't ready, for every woman who had been talked over, for every immigrant family who had been told they didn't belong. This was a stage where silence or surrender would echo far beyond the walls of that room. Pompeo thought he was challenging one woman's record. What he was really doing was challenging her very right to lead. But Pompeo didn't realize Crockett had been preparing for battles like this her entire life. Mike Pompeo is not the kind of man who enters a room unnoticed. His presence arrives before he speaks, the heavy credentials, the polished confidence, the aura of someone who has always believed he belongs at the top. To his supporters, he is the disciplined West Point graduate, the Harvard law scholar, the soldier-turned-statesman who climbed the ladder of American power with military precision. To his critics, he is something else. A man who has worn his resume like a suit of armor, using it not only to defend himself but to dismiss anyone who dares challenge him. At West Point, Pompeo was praised for his drive, graduating first in his class. That fact alone became a weapon he wielded for years, a constant reminder that he had proven himself superior even at a young age. Later, at Harvard Law, he mastered the art of rhetoric, honing a style that was as sharp as it was dismissive. His words often carried the weight of authority not just because of what he said but because of how he said it, measured, unflinching, laced with the implicit message, "I know more than you ever will." From Congress to the CIA to the State Department, Pompeo carried that same energy into every arena. As CIA director, he portrayed himself as the no-nonsense guardian of American security, speaking with a certainty that discouraged dissent. As Secretary of State, he traveled the world projecting toughness, always positioning himself as the adult in the room. To many, his speeches and press conferences felt less like explanations and more like lectures, statements handed down from someone who expected to be obeyed, not questioned. But beneath that polished armor lay contradictions that never went unnoticed. He spoke often of integrity, yet critics recalled his willingness to bend truths when it suited political goals. He championed transparency abroad while dodging accountability at home. He preached respect for American values, yet was accused of blurring the lines between diplomacy and partisanship. For every claim of principle, there seemed to be a story that undermined it, a travel controversy, a political maneuver, a moment of arrogance that revealed the cracks beneath the polished exterior. His rhetorical style only amplified these contradictions. When confronted, Pompeo rarely engaged with the substance of criticism. Instead, he leaned on dismissiveness. He cut down reporters with smirks. He brushed off colleagues with withering lines. He controlled narratives not by out-debating but by out-intimidating. The message was clear: challenge him at your own risk. Most never pushed far enough to see him falter. And that was the persona he carried into his clash with Jasmine Crockett. To him, this was routine. Another debate. Another opportunity to remind an opponent that experience outweighed freshness, that his years of global authority outshined her fledgling career. It was the same playbook he had used time and again: reduce the opponent, assert dominance, let the weight of his reputation do the heavy lifting. But audiences had grown weary of this playbook. In an age where authenticity carried more weight than rehearsed arrogance, Pompeo's style felt increasingly hollow. The more he leaned on his credentials, the more it exposed a man who seemed unwilling or perhaps unable to acknowledge that power was shifting. That leadership could come from voices beyond the traditional mold. That strength could come not from dismissing others but from listening. For progressives watching, Pompeo represented everything they distrusted about establishment politics. The polished resume that excused arrogance, the habit of punching down, the contradictions between values preached and actions taken. He was the archetype of an old guard villain, sharp, calculating, and utterly convinced that the world still belonged to him. It was a persona that had carried him far, but also one that carried a fatal flaw. Because when arrogance becomes armor, it blinds you to what lies ahead. Pompeo had faced opponents who argued, shouted, even protested. But he had never faced Jasmine Crockett, a woman who would meet his arrogance not with volume but with something far more devastating: composure. And in that silence, in that calm defiance, Pompeo's most trusted weapon, his ability to dominate through presence alone, would suddenly fail him. But against Jasmine Crockett, that armor of arrogance would soon crack. Long before Jasmine Crockett walked onto the national stage, long before she sparred with political heavyweights on live television, she was already sharpening her resolve in spaces most Americans never see. She began her career not in the marble halls of Washington, but in courtrooms where the stakes were raw and immediate, where ordinary people faced extraordinary systems that seemed stacked against them. As an attorney, she didn't chase glamour cases or lucrative contracts. She took on the work many avoided: defending those without resources, representing communities that had been silenced, fighting for individuals who couldn't fight for themselves. Her path was never easy, and that is precisely what forged her. In Texas, she stood in courtrooms where prosecutors towered with the full weight of the state behind them, and she stood beside clients who felt powerless, voiceless, forgotten. She knew what it meant to argue not just for one person but for the principle that every person, regardless of money, race, or status, deserved justice. Time and again she faced dismissiveness, sometimes outright hostility, but she answered with grit. That grit became her signature, a quiet fire that no amount of intimidation could extinguish. Her activism flowed naturally from that work. For Crockett, the law was never separate from life. It was the thread connecting dignity, opportunity, and justice. She marched, she organized, she listened. She put herself in spaces where people were hurting not because it was politically advantageous, but because it was morally necessary. When systemic inequality pressed down, she pushed back, not for the sake of recognition, but because she believed silence in the face of injustice was complicity. So when Crockett entered Congress, she carried that fire with her. But Washington was not a courtroom. Here the battles were often disguised in procedure, cloaked in civility, laced with the same arrogance she had seen in prosecutors who thought their authority made them untouchable. Almost immediately she was underestimated. A freshman, a woman, a black progressive voice in a chamber still dominated by old guard traditions. Some thought she would play the background role, a quiet presence expected to learn her place. But Jasmine Crockett had never been one to stay silent when truth demanded a voice. Her early days in Congress were trials of their own. She was targeted with interruptions during hearings, brushed off in debates, and treated as if her passion was a flaw rather than a strength. Critics tried to paint her as inexperienced, too fiery, too unwilling to conform. Yet in each instance she responded not with surrender but with resilience. She spoke with clarity even when others tried to drown her out. She asked sharp questions that cut through rehearsed talking points. She became known not for playing by the rules of arrogance, but for challenging them. What set her apart was not simply her ability to argue. It was her moral compass. Crockett never saw politics as a ladder to climb but as a platform to elevate those who had long been kept at the bottom. Where others measured success by titles gained or committees secured, she measured it by whether she had defended dignity, whether she had spoken truth, whether she had carried forward the stories of those who entrusted her with their voice. She was not chasing power for its own sake. She was chasing justice. That distinction mattered, because it meant that when she faced off against men like Mike Pompeo, she wasn't just debating policy points. She was drawing from lived experience, from years of standing in the trenches where the consequences of injustice weren't theoretical. They were human, urgent, and deeply personal. Every time she had been dismissed in a courtroom, every time her questions had been waved away in Congress, every time someone tried to reduce her to a footnote in history. All of that had built her into a leader who could not be rattled by arrogance. And perhaps most importantly, she carried something Pompeo never could: authenticity. She did not need to hide behind credentials. She did not need to inflate her importance. She stood as herself, unpolished at times, unapologetic always, willing to speak with the kind of candor that made some uncomfortable but made many more feel seen for the first time. Her presence told every young person watching, every marginalized voice wondering if they belonged, that the seat at the table was not reserved for the few. It could be claimed by anyone with the courage to step into the fire and not flinch. By the time Crockett sat across from Pompeo, she had already lived through countless battles that tested her resilience. The courtroom dismissals, the congressional interruptions, the endless attempts to question her legitimacy, all of it was preparation. She had been trained not by privilege but by struggle. And that struggle had armed her with something more potent than titles or years in office: the ability to stand in the face of arrogance and refuse to bend. So when Pompeo leaned on his record, when he pressed with that practiced air of superiority, Crockett did not waver. She had already seen what arrogance looked like. She had already survived the weight of dismissal. And she had already learned that dignity, when held firm, has the power to silence even the loudest voices of condescension. And when Pompeo tried to corner her on live television, Crockett reached deep into that very journey. The clash did not begin with fireworks. It began with Pompeo's steady, deliberate voice, low, calculated, the tone of a man who had played this game 1,000 times. He opened his attack not with a question but with an accusation, dissecting Crockett's record as if he were a surgeon and she the unworthy subject. His words dripped with authority, each syllable sharpened by years of rhetorical training. He listed off votes, clipped sound bites, carefully chosen fragments of her career, presenting them not as context but as weapons. Crockett sat still, her eyes fixed on him. She didn't interrupt. She didn't raise her voice. She let the barrage wash over her, calm as a stone in a storm. Around them the tension built like static in the air. Viewers leaned forward. In the chamber you could feel the unease ripple, a collective shifting of bodies in their seats. Pompeo smirked at that reaction, mistaking discomfort for victory. His strategy was obvious: dominate the stage, drown her under the weight of his experience, make her presence seem small. He emphasized his years of service, his global stature, his credentials like badges of honor. And each time he brought up her name, he said it with a tone of dismissal, as though she were a novice daring to spar with a general. The longer he spoke, the more he indulged himself, growing louder, more animated, his voice cutting sharper with each point. He leaned forward, eyes flashing, his smirk widening each time Crockett remained quiet. He thought her silence was surrender, but it was something else entirely. In the silence, a beat emerged. It was as if the sound of a slow, deliberate heartbeat pulsed beneath the exchange. Each moment Pompeo overextended, that beat grew louder, more insistent, pulling the audience deeper into the tension. The silence was not empty, it was loaded, like the pause before a storm breaks. People in the room shifted again, some glancing toward Crockett, wondering when or if she would respond. Anger began to build, not just at Pompeo's words but at the arrogance behind them. He wasn't simply challenging her policies. He was belittling her very place at the table, treating her like a prop in his own performance. And still, she waited. Her face was composed, her hands steady, her eyes unwavering. She let him talk, let him pile arrogance upon arrogance until the weight of his words began to feel less like authority and more like desperation. Pompeo leaned back in his chair finally, satisfied, his smirk stretching into something close to a grin. He had delivered his blows, stacked his record against hers, painted himself as the inevitable victor. He believed the silence confirmed it, that Crockett was cornered, that she had nothing left to say. The room seemed to hold its breath. That slow, cinematic heartbeat pounded in the background of every listener's mind. Was she rattled? Was she broken? And then, just when Pompeo thought he'd broken her, Crockett leaned in. For a long moment after Pompeo finished, the room was still. The air carried the weight of his words, sharpened and stacked like a fortress meant to trap her inside. He leaned back in his chair, lips curling into that familiar smirk, convinced he had made his point, convinced the silence meant victory. But then Jasmine Crockett leaned in, not hurried, not flustered, but with the slow, deliberate composure of someone who had weathered storms before and learned that the calmest voice in the room often carries the most power. Her tone was steady, her voice low but clear enough to cut through the air like glass. "Mr. Pompeo," she began, not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with a clarity that made every person in that chamber look up. "You've listed my votes, you've painted your version of my record, but you've left out the part where those votes were not about me, they were about the people who sent me here." The smirk faltered just slightly. Crockett pressed on. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't match his aggression. Instead, she slowed the tempo, forcing the audience to lean in closer. She cited the policies Pompeo had twisted, but not with technical jargon, with stories. The family in Texas that couldn't afford healthcare until legislation she fought for expanded access. The small business owner who told her government programs kept their doors open. The community leaders who called her not because she was the most senior member of Congress, but because she was the one who actually picked up the phone. Where Pompeo's attack had been abstract, a list of bullet points meant to intimidate, Crockett's response was grounded, human, impossible to dismiss. Facts woven with moral weight, receipts delivered with dignity. Each example landed like a quiet blow, the kind that lingers longer than shouting ever could. The room grew quieter still. You could almost hear that slow, cinematic heartbeat again. She paused, letting the silence work for her. Then she shifted gears, not just rebutting his claims but reframing the entire exchange. "You talk about years of service," she said, her eyes locked on him. "You talk about titles, credentials, offices held. And yes, you've held them, but power isn't measured by the weight of your resume. It's measured by the lives you've touched, by the dignity you defend, by whether you use your position to lift people up or to look down on them." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Pompeo straightened in his chair, his hands tightening around the armrests. Crockett leaned in further, her tone still calm, almost conversational. "I wasn't sent here to impress you. I wasn't sent here to play by the rules of those who think power belongs only to the few. I was sent here to fight for the people who don't get invited into rooms like this. And every time someone like you tries to reduce me to inexperience or to dismiss my right to stand here, you're not just attacking me, you're attacking them, and I will never stay silent in the face of that." Gasps broke out, someone shifted audibly in their seat. A tension, almost electric, filled the air. Pompeo's face, once lit with smug certainty, now betrayed the faintest flicker of unease. His smirk had vanished entirely, replaced by the kind of tight-lipped silence that speaks louder than words. Crockett didn't stop. She pressed the contrast home, turning his arrogance into a mirror that reflected back on him. "You call my record weak because it's not built on decades of titles. But those titles you wear so proudly, they didn't stop ordinary families from struggling. They didn't keep communities from being ignored. They didn't silence injustice. And if your definition of leadership is reminding everyone how important you are, then maybe that's the real weakness exposed here tonight." This time, the murmur grew louder. People exchanged glances. Some leaned back, others leaned forward, all caught in the realization that the balance of power in the room had shifted. Then came the pause, the kind of pause every great orator understands. She let the silence stretch, let the weight of her words sink in. She didn't need to fill the air, she had already claimed it. When she spoke again, her words cut to the universal truth. Dignity will always outlast arrogance. You can smirk, you can interrupt, you can lean on the weight of your record, but history doesn't remember the loudest in the room, it remembers the ones who stood their ground with truth. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the sound of realization, of arrogance deflating, of a man who suddenly had nothing left to say. Pompeo shifted in his chair. His eyes flickered away for the briefest moment, his shoulders stiffened. For once, the man who prided himself on controlling every room he entered no longer controlled this one. And then it happened, the audience, unable to contain themselves any longer, erupted. Applause, cheers, murmurs of admiration. The energy shifted completely, pouring toward Crockett in waves. Viewers watching at home clipped the moment instantly, posting it online with captions like, "She silenced him with truth and dignity wins." Pompeo sat still, his lips pressed tightly, his face a mask trying to hold steady. But his silence told the story. The man who had once wielded words like weapons now found himself defenseless against the simplest weapon of all, calm, undeniable truth. For Jasmine Crockett, it was not about scoring points or basking in applause. It was about proving a principle she had carried with her for years, that dignity, when held firm, can silence arrogance without ever needing to shout. And in that moment, she proved it not just to Pompeo, not just to the chamber, but to the millions who would soon replay the clip again and again. But the battle didn't end in that room, it exploded across the nation. The silence in that chamber didn't end with the final word. It spilled outward, captured by cameras, clipped by viewers, amplified in seconds across the vast digital stage. By the time the broadcast wrapped, the moment had already begun its second life online, where silence can be replayed endlessly, dissected frame by frame, and turned into a cultural lightning strike. Within an hour, hashtags erupted across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. #Crockett silences Pompeo, dignity over arrogance, she said it all. Memes bloomed instantly. One showed Pompeo's frozen face with the caption, "When your resume can't save you." Another looped Crockett's final line, "Dignity will always outlast arrogance," set to swelling background music that made it feel like a movie trailer. Commentators jumped in almost immediately. Progressive voices called it a generational shift, a symbolic breaking of the old guard's grip on the narrative. This wasn't just a debate moment, one influencer tweeted. It was a reminder that truth delivered calmly can still cut louder than decades of bluster. Journalists replayed the silence, counting the beats between Pompeo's last words and Crockett's reply, marveling at how she'd weaponized patience as strategy. But it wasn't just political commentators. Ordinary people who had never heard of Jasmine Crockett before suddenly knew her name. Teachers in classrooms shared the clip as an example of composure under pressure. Activists posted it alongside stories of their own struggles against dismissive authority. Young women, especially women of color, stitched her words into TikTok videos saying, this is what it looks like to refuse to be dismissed." The momentum grew. Crockett became a trending topic not just in the United States but globally. Across the Atlantic, British commentators framed it as an example of America's new generation standing firm against arrogance. In Asia and Africa, social media posts echoed a similar sentiment. Here was a leader who looked like them, who spoke in terms not of status but of dignity, who had turned condescension into silence without ever losing her calm. Meanwhile, Pompeo's silence took on a life of its own. The still frame of his frozen expression became a meme paired with captions like, "When the truth finally catches you," or "Big resume, small answers." Even some conservatives, though unwilling to concede the argument, admitted grudging respect for Crockett's poise, calling it a tactical win that Pompeo had failed to anticipate. Television panels replayed the exchange on loop. Some networks tried to frame it as a clash of experience versus inexperience, but the images spoke louder than the pundits. No spin could erase the fact that Pompeo, one of the sharpest tongues in Washington, had been left without words, that silence had become the story. And Crockett, she became more than just a congresswoman in that moment. She became a symbol of courage in the face of dismissal, a symbol of what it means to represent with integrity, not intimidation, a symbol of possibility for those who had grown tired of watching power used as a weapon against them. In the days that followed, donations to her campaign surged. Grassroots organizations used her speech as a rallying cry, saying, "This is why we fight." Young voters began sharing her biography, framing her as someone who carried the lived experiences of those who too often felt ignored. In living rooms, classrooms, and community halls, people talked about her not as a politician, but as a representative in the truest sense, someone who stood firm not for her own ego, but for those she represented. Vindication radiated across the digital landscape. For her supporters, the viral moment was proof that justice and dignity could win even against the most seasoned of adversaries. For marginalized voices, it was a collective exhale. Finally, someone had stood their ground and turned condescension into silence. But even as the memes multiplied and the hashtags climbed, a deeper question lingered. Because beyond the viral fame, beyond the laughter at Pompeo's silence or the cheers for Crockett's poise, the true meaning of this clash would echo deeper. In the days that followed, when asked about the moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't bask in the applause or point to the viral memes. Instead, she spoke with the same calm that had carried her through the exchange itself. To her, this wasn't about humiliating Mike Pompeo. It wasn't about scoring points or winning a soundbite. It was about something much larger. She framed it not as a victory of one person over another, but as a reminder of what dignity looks like when it meets arrogance head-on. "You don't always have to shout to be heard," she said in one interview. "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand firm, stay calm, and let the truth speak for itself." Her words resonated because they weren't just commentary on a single debate. They were a reflection of a deeper struggle, one that millions recognized in their own lives. How many times had people been talked over in classrooms, in boardrooms, in political spaces? How many times had voices been dismissed, not because they lacked truth, but because they lacked the backing of power or pedigree? Crockett's moment was proof that those dismissals could be shattered, not with rage, but with resolve. She reminded her audience that democracy is not meant to be a performance where the loudest wins. It is meant to be a space where truth, no matter how softly spoken, carries weight. Her calmness under pressure, her refusal to match Pompeo's aggression with aggression, showed that composure itself can be an act of defiance. It was a reclaiming of power on her terms. "In a time of shouting," she said in a speech days later, "silence can be the loudest echo when it comes from truth." That line spread almost as widely as her debate clip, appearing on posters, captions, even protest signs. It became not just a reflection on that night, but a philosophy for a generation hungry for leaders who represent integrity over intimidation. The lesson was clear. Democracy is strongest when it remembers that representation is not about who speaks the loudest, but who speaks with conviction, grounded in justice. Crockett's exchange with Pompeo became a parable of sorts, a reminder that arrogance, no matter how seasoned or credentialed, cannot withstand the quiet strength of dignity. For her supporters, the moral was deeply empowering. It meant that truth could still cut through noise. It meant that someone who looked like them, who carried their stories, could not only stand in the halls of power but could hold her ground against its most intimidating voices. For others, it was an invitation to reflect on the kind of politics they wanted to see: less performance, more principle. The exchange had started as a clash between two figures, but it ended as something bigger, a turning point in how people understood leadership. It wasn't about dominance. It wasn't about the resume. It was about the values carried into the room and the courage to let those values speak louder than ego. And that is why this clash will be remembered not as a takedown, but as a turning point. Mike Pompeo came into that room with every weapon in his arsenal: credentials, experience, the sharpness of a tongue that had cut down countless opponents before. He aimed those weapons at Jasmine Crockett, convinced he could rattle her, diminish her, leave her scrambling. But instead, his attack became the very stage on which she rose higher. With one reply, calm, deliberate, undeniable, she didn't just defend herself, she stunned him into silence. That silence is what echoes now, not the bluster, not the arrogance, not the resume recited like a shield. What remains is the image of a woman standing firm, reminding the nation that dignity will always outlast arrogance. That truth, when spoken with conviction, will always break through noise. This was more than a debate moment. It was a lesson for all of us. In our politics, in our communities, in our lives, the choice is the same: meet arrogance with arrogance or meet it with clarity, composure, and the unshakable weight of truth. Jasmine Crockett chose the latter, and history will remember that choice. If you believe truth still matters in America, share this story. Subscribe for more moments that reveal the battles shaping our future. Add your voice to this movement of people who refuse to be silenced, who believe that dignity is not weakness but strength. Because sometimes, the calmest voice in the room is the one history remembers.